Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of The Ghost Furnace. I am joined this evening by my cohort Nick Pennsylvania. How you doing, Nick?
I'm doing all right this evening.
And we have a special guest with us this evening. We are joined by Thomas White. Tom, how you doing? Doing excellent. Awesome. We've talked about some of the stories you guys are going to hear about tonight. Thomas White is an author here in Pittsburgh. He is the University Archivist and Curator of Special Collections at Duquesne University and also an adjunct professor at La Roche, which are two local universities here in the Pittsburgh area. And he has written extensively on folklore here in our area. Me and Nick have read quite a few of his books, and he's written a lot of them. So tonight we're going to just ask him some questions around folklore, some of the books he's written, some of the stories he's collected, and just kind of see where the conversation takes us. So does that sound good to you guys? Awesome. So Tom, my first question that I ask anybody who's into these kind of things is, how did you get into folklore in the first place?
I guess always since I've been a little kid, I was interested in history and like folklore and weird stories. You know, like I used to read those Reader's Digest books. My mom used to buy them. You know, they had like Mysteries of the Unexplained and things like that, you know. And but I also always loved history, and probably the blurring of the two. Actually, I think back of when I was like, you know, in 1981 when I saw Indiana Raiders of the Lost Ark. You know, it's kind of like history and the supernatural combined. But I always liked that stuff. My mom was always kind of into that stuff when I was growing up as well. So I kind of had it was always around, you know what I mean? Like, you know, Loch Ness Monster wasn't a weird topic, you know what I mean? Like, so it was like something you could just talk about. And I used to love watching In Search Of, you know, as I think many people did of my age.
Leonard Nimoy.
Yeah. And so, you know, I always just liked the mysterious stuff, right? But I liked regular history too. So I went to college and I actually did my undergrad at La Roche. I had this great professor, Ed Brett, who had a PhD in medieval studies, but then he specialized in Latin America later. But then what he really studied was the history of religion, right? So I got a broad history of, you know, basically what people believe, you know, and that really ties into a lot. And there's so much. Just at that time, they were starting to do academic work on these topics that were formerly off limits. You know, not really until the 90s do you have like serious academic work done on things like UFO. I mean, you always have the folklore, but like topics addressed that are acceptable for like historians, for example. And so I just, you know, I always collected these stories. I always loved hearing these stories. I liked the idea of folklore and what folklore could tell you. I like traditional history, and I went to graduate school. I got a degree in public history where it's making history accessible to the public. And a lot of that interaction involves folklore and legends and stories. And so I worked for 6 years at the Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh, which is one of the 10 largest museums in the country. History museums in the country. It's a Smithsonian affiliate. And, you know, it was a great place. And there's so much information. There are so many things. And, you know, I'd sit there and think, I used to hear that ghost story about this or that. Why don't I just look up the real story while I'm sitting there? You know, I mean, like, what did that building really exist? Was that really an orphanage? Was that, you know, and I just kind of started going. And, you know, a couple other things that influenced my two favorite stories growing up were Pittsburgh stories were Blue Mist Road, which I always heard about in high school, and the Lost Bomber of the Monongahela, which is more of a conspiracy theory. And I always remember my grandfather worked for the Pittsburgh Press for decades, and he used to I always remember in like around 1980 or 81, would go over there every Friday for dinner. And I remember he had those big newspaper articles. He did a big 2-part spread on the B-25 around that time. And I always remember, like, you know, I wasn't that old at that point, but I remember having my parents explain it to me and just always having an interest from that point. So I got the History Center. I started doing that work, did some research, wrote some articles. I ended up going to Duquesne and teaching history and also running the archives and dealing with their artifacts, and then teaching history and then folklore at La Roche as well. And I just started gathering more stuff and writing the books, and just it kind of snowballed, right? You hear one story, then you hear another and another and another. And part of the reason is Pennsylvania is really this hotbed of folklore and legends. back in the 70s, folklorists traced the way legends traveled around the country. There's this chart. It's not a very good chart, but it's a chart demonstrating how the stuff spread. Folklorists put it together in the 70s. And basically all the folklore that isn't just stuff that stayed like in the Louisiana coast, deep south, and stuff that came like from Russian or Chinese immigrants on the West Coast, or Hispanic immigrants, from the South, everything else funneled into Pennsylvania, and then came to a point at Pittsburgh, and then spread back out across the country, the way they tracked the way this folklore moved.
I'm kind of curious as to reasons why that is, because I've got, your Vanishing Hitchhiker, which kind of documents, tries to get to some of the origins of stories. Yeah. Is that because of migration patterns in America or immigration patterns in America? Yeah,
there's a couple of things that make Pennsylvania the ideal place to study folklore. If you look, some of the top folklorists of the country have worked here. People like Simon Bronner, and in the past, people like David Hufford, who did a lot of the stuff initially with the sleep paralysis, the old hag syndrome. Pennsylvania had a couple things. First of all, it was, and we tend to forget now, Pennsylvania isn't, necessarily the most impressive state to outsiders, but Pennsylvania was one of the most important states in early America, especially like pre-Civil War or even post-Civil War of the industry, but just in general. Plus, it had relative religious freedom early on. So you had all the people with unusual beliefs that came here. Mm-hmm. Plus, to go west, we were the original gateway of the West, for St. Louis. In fact, the arch was built by Pittsburgh companies.
Well, exactly.
Up in Warren, Warren, PA, is they right now, if you're driving on 6 into the city of Warren, outside Starbucks, they have a little miniature, and they are very proud that they are the birthplace of the St. Louis Arch there.
Yeah. And it was a lot of Pittsburgh companies like Pitt Des Moines and a whole bunch of other companies physically put it together. A lot of the things that are thought of like being like frontier, like the Kentucky long rifle, it's just the Pennsylvania long rifle renamed. And the whiskey, Kentucky bourbon, that was the whiskey people that were driven out of Western Pennsylvania during the Whiskey Rebellion. So
I've talked about this because wasn't it Thomas Jefferson, who was then governor, was grandfathering because the Commonwealth of Virginia had a sea to sea charter, but instead of just going straight across, they spanned out. As I recall, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania declared war on the Commonwealth of Virginia at that time.
Yeah, there was a battle over Pittsburgh, basically. And there were two governments claiming control, Lord Dunmore, and then you had St. Clair come out, and basically he was based in Westmoreland County around Hannistown, and which is also supposed to be haunted. Hannistown.
I keep hearing about that place. Yeah, I keep hearing about it.
Yeah, and then then Pittsburgh, Lord Dunmore came in. What basically resolved it ultimately was the American Revolution. Then the states had to make an agreement, fight the common enemy. But and that's the very simplified historical version. If there's a colonial historian listening, I know it's more complicated than that. But
it's one of those amazing facts that I love. There was all of that and the disputes between that territory, and the fact that even during the Revolution, our whole western border was never really defined.
And
I find all that fascinating.
This was all the Ohio country, they called it for a long time. So it's we tend to define a lot of stuff by lines on maps and imaginary things, but but back then it wasn't as clear. But so Pennsylvania's had a hotspot. The other thing that makes especially Western Pennsylvania a great place to study folklore is people retain, especially in the Pittsburgh area, their identity. If you move away, like, you go to Phoenix, there's a Pittsburgh bar. There's no Phoenix bar in Pittsburgh. You know what I mean? There's no, there's a Pittsburgh bar in Italy, in Rome. But people come back and they retain that knowledge. And before the internet, the way folklore would work is that, all legends had like a half-life, like they were like decaying radiation. So if you didn't, the way legends developed, if you didn't catch them like on the first half as they were spreading and reached their peak, then you got a diminished version of the legend. And it wasn't passed on. But the longer people are in an area, the longer that peak lasts.
Of like that bell curve gets wider at the top.
Yeah. And so you have more time and more people hear the story. Whereas if you have a transient population, the stories might last a couple of years and they're gone.
That's a really interesting look at it, just because I've always considered that, we have the Scotch Irish, the Germans, they settled, they're everywhere in America, but this area has a uniquely large Slavic population, and I didn't
Yes.
know if that contributed to some of the origin stories to some of it. But you're right, because I mean, KDK is always very quick to tell everybody about Pittsburgh bars that they cite in different locales. And I've always said too that one of the things that appeals to me about Western Pennsylvania, about really the northern tier of Pennsylvania as well, coming from other states, having lived in other places, is that it seems to be one of the few places that isn't all entirely encompassed and interested in what's going on outside of their area.
Yeah.
I think that's a unique aspect too. I don't know if you feel that way.
Yeah, no, definitely. There's still a bit of regionalism that's retained.
Right.
And there's only parts of those. There's other areas that are like that around the country too, but they tend to be smaller pockets. But those are also the best areas for folklore. You have areas where you have the strong regional identity that isn't depending or changing based on, so many cities in America you go, they look exactly the same as every other city. You couldn't, if you didn't know where you were, you wouldn't know where you were.
Well, I've always said my fear, the continued homogenization of places. I remember writing a paper when I was in college doing linguistics and whatnot about the Pittsburgh busing system. And they initially had a non-regional dialect on the bus on the intercom thing, and people were missing their stops supposedly. Interesting thing, but folklore is really one way I think you could define it is a story. It's an explanation of origins. It's something you wrap a communal identity around. I had never thought about the people staying in the area for as long as they have as being a contributor to the richness of it, but it makes perfect sense.
Right, because one of the things I was going to ask you about that we kind of already got onto is the idea of looking at these like very small areas for folklore. And that's why it's so interesting for me to hear you talk about how, like, academically, this is actually a really rich area, because, like, I could be wrong, but there's probably not like multiple books on the folklore of like Southwest Iowa. You're
right. Yeah.
Like that's not to disparage that place or anything, but it seems like you were saying when you were kind of growing up and everything, hearing all these stories, like I've always felt that like it seems like this place is special, and it's interesting to hear that there is a historically folklore-centric reason for that has all these cultural elements kind of coming together. And that kind of leads to one of the questions that I kind of would like to get your opinion on. I've always said that folklore, it serves a purpose in society. That's why it's worth documenting. And that's why it's worth both not only historic study, but study at the time contemporarily. What is your view of folklore as far as its role in society and culture?
Yeah, it's extremely important as a gauge to measure what's going on, first of all. And also, folklore does two things, like these legends. They're a form of history, but maybe not always factually accurate history, but they're representing people that often aren't covered in traditional history. So, like, if you look at like ghost stories from the 1800s, almost all the ghost stories, like 60% are women. Like, then the rest are either immigrants or African American. You see very few, now occasionally, but you see very few like dead white Protestant lawyer ghosts. You know what I mean? Like,
right. No, that's really true.
Yeah.
When you do encounter them, they're usually being told from the perspective of, like, they're usually depicted as being this, I'm trying to find a better word, but like,
reverence.
I figure this person that people did not really get on with. Being told from those people.
Exactly. And so folklore has that historical element. A lot of times it involves disasters or things like that. But it also, the more modern active element is, of course, it carries warnings, expresses fears, tensions.
Yes.
The classic example of this, and that you probably covered this when you talk about Blue Mist Road, but like it's one example, but there's literally hundreds of legends across the country that during the 1980s, the Satanic Panic left that imprint on all kinds of folklore, and that directly reflected what was going on in society. Suddenly there's Satanists everywhere. They're abducting kids. There's this danger to children, which is kind of an outgrowth of social changes in the 70s. And so you have, this really distinct, reaction to things going on. And you still see it. The trouble is lots of times people don't see it as it's happening, or you can't figure out exactly what it means. I mean, a lot of people are still trying to interpret like the last clown panic around 2016.
Yeah.
Like people are trying to still figure out exactly what that meant. I mean, was that just like, I mean, there were so many possible, explanations, but
and that kind of leads me to one of the other kind of like I guess like academic questions around folklore. How has the internet and YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, how has that affected folklore?
I would even go on to say just televised news, because
televised
where
news,
did most people see all those clown stories?
Yeah.
Where was the satanic panic being promulgated through? A lot of it was news stories.
Yeah. And one of the the keys too, and this is not, this isn't meant to be political or anything, but the news, like if you watch the news now and you watch the news from like 1970 and Walter Cronkite, they are like two different things. You know what I mean? Like one's like an entertainment show now. It's just like, let's scare them again. Not that it hasn't always been that way, but there's a brief time where they tried to at least hide it.
Yeah. Neil Postman in the 1980s asked the question, why does the news have a soundtrack?
Yeah, exactly. So you have, the news, it has its own agenda, but you have, the internet. Definitely, the internet is a blessing and a curse in some ways. Now, the internet is very helpful. I know in my research, like when the internet first started coming out, I thought for sure that's going to be the end of folklore. You know what I mean? But
yeah,
a lot of people did that. It's going to mess it up. It's not going to. But then what you learn is that it created its own genre. I mean, it gave us Slender Man and all these other legends. And, it often involved technology. And when you deal with the supernatural and legends, a lot of it involves technology. In the 50s and 60s, it was cars, because everyone was driving cars everybody had access to cars all of a sudden, car culture in America. So technology always goes with the supernatural, whether we realize it or not. But yeah, I think what the internet has done is it's allowed us to look like, when I was doing a lot of research today on Blue Mist Road, I'll keep using that as an example right now. You could ask a question and then all these people will chime in, and I was in high school in 1979. This is what I heard. Well, I was in high school in 1985, and this is what I heard. And I was and you suddenly can get all of these pieces if you do it right, and track how the legend changes. I mean,
right?
They're not always
data points now, kind of. Yeah, you can actually. Oh, that's interesting.
Can we talk Blue Mist Road for a minute? Because
sure.
There always, to me, seem to be two very different Blue Mist Road stories. Yeah. And the one story involves the tree where there was supposedly lynchings, and it seems like there's a second story that also is titled Blue Mist Road in the public, and it has more to do with two gravestones that supposedly touch one another on certain atmospheric and lunar cycles have to be right. Since you brought up how you can see how the story evolved, have you seen that there are like two distinct, or are there more stories that fall under the banner of Blue Mist?
Oh, there's probably a dozen more. So
really,
Blue Mist Road is one of my favorites. I've studied it the most. I've probably interviewed over 300 people about it with different versions of the legend.
Wow.
A quick evolution of how the legends developed. So the earliest legends on Blue Mist Road developed in the late 60s, early 70s, when the road was still open. And for anybody listening that doesn't know, Blue Mist Road's its real name is Irwin Road. It runs along Irwin Run. It does actually create a bluish mist when you shine your headlights through, which is where it gets its name. It used to be an open road. Now the first maybe half mile is open, but it's a park road and you're not supposed to be driving down it. Then there's about 2 miles. It's now a trail owned by the Allegheny Land Trust, the old road that's crumbling. And there's some ruins off of there. And then the last half mile or so is a neighborhood. And then across the street, it reaches Route 910. It goes from Babcock to 910, cuts the corner. And across the street from those houses is Crossroads Cemetery. And in that cemetery, tombstones.
I was going to ask about that.
Lean toward each other. So the earliest legends were the tombstone legend that at midnight, those tombstones would touch basically, and they were husband and wife. And basically it was like kissing at midnight under a full moon.
Right.
Seems pretty harmless. Then the other early story, probably, early 70s, was that a family was driving down the road, and in most versions it was a drunk driver, sometimes it's a deer, came up the other direction, caused them to swerve. They went off the road, crashed, and the whole family was killed. And if you drove your car down to that spot and you put it in neutral, the family's ghost would push your car away from the scene of the accident.
That sounds like one of those stories that is everywhere, because
Yes.
I heard that in Mississippi as a kid, and it was on the train tracks and the school bus, and that seems like
There's one in Texas too.
Hitchhiker.
Yeah, it's one of those stories that's everywhere.
Yeah.
So those were the earliest stories. Then sometime in the mid 70s, around 75 to 77, the stories turned darker. And this directly corresponds to changes in American society, like things going on. You get, by the mid 70s, stories about the Ku Klux Klan using the road and the hanging tree. Now, the hanging tree isn't always associated with them, but it usually is. And back then, there were a whole bunch of trees that hung over the road. So you had to guess which one. You could tell because the tree bled when the moon was full, allegedly. Of course.
As one does.
Or you might discover it by finding
of our native trees.
Yeah. And so you might discover it by finding the ghost of the last person they hung. Now, you'd assume that it would all be African Americans because it's the Ku Klux Klan. But in this legend, it really wasn't. It could be anybody that stumbled across their meeting place would be the next victim. So
brings the threat level up.
Yeah, there's a real physical danger plus the ghosts now.
Right.
And so, but then by the early 80s, you have the addition of the satanic cults or the witches' coven that uses the ruins of what they call the cult house or the witch house up on the hill that burned, an old house that burned down with a big barn, stone foundation. The ruins are still there. And that's where you get a whole slew of stories throughout the 1980s of satanic cults abducting people and sacrifices and bipedal hoof prints being seen on the road. And that's a lot of what I heard in high school was the satanic cult stories.
Yeah, and I have to say, I have never heard the one about the family pushing the car. Yeah. And I imagine that maybe you said earlier about there's a time. I think because that is such a cut and paste story that it hasn't endured. Because I have never heard that Blue Mist version.
And that was the earliest one. And the other reason probably it was there in the first place is if you're familiar with North Park, and this is now people, when you talk to young people, you got to remind them this was pre-internet. So it's all word of mouth where these things are. So people heard about what they called the Ghost Hill or Gravity Hill in North Park. And that was supposedly haunted. Same story. It's at Coomer and McKinney roads, actually. It's an optical illusion. You look like you're rolling uphill. You're not. But in the past, in the 70s, what we think is people didn't know the exact location. So the creepy story got stuck on a creepier looking road. And in fact, there's no Gravity Hill on Blue Mist Road.
That makes sense.
We did discover there was an accident there, though, in 1973 where a mother was killed and her kids were in the car. So we think that's the origin accident story.
Okay.
Triggered the other one.
Right.
Or at least it gives credence. But it's true. If you're going to have a spooky looking road, there has to be a spooky related motor vehicle accident. Yeah. Like we've talked so much, like that house is clearly haunted. Just look at it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, the ambiance. Like you go down Blue Mist Road now, there's not a lot there, but people get freaked out all the time, and weird stuff does actually
happen. Like me and my brother, we did an episode where we walked down that road, one of our early episodes, and like it was just kind of like, I can see why it's spooky. And for some reason there was like 3 red-tailed hawks over the creek there, just going nuts. And it's like, oh yes, that's weird. Like I get why people get weirded out back here.
One time I took my folklore class there and we walked the whole way. I time it so we get all the way to the end, right when the sun goes down, so we come the whole way back in the dark, right?
Nice.
So we were coming back, and this class had about 7 or 8 people in it, and suddenly we hear all this splashing down over the hill and down where Irwin Run is. But we're at the most remote part of the road where there's nothing in either direction. It's about a mile from a house or 2. And it was kind of muddy down there, and it was like steep drop off. And we shine the flashlights down, and we see this dog running back and forth in the creek. Doesn't look like it has a leash, just back and forth like a broken record.
Oh, that's weird.
Then we see feet. They bring the flashlight up, and there's this old couple that looks like a modern version of the American Gothic painting, standing perfectly still beside each other, not moving. Then when the light hits the guy's face, he says, "Can you please turn out the light?"
Yeah, this is not
Out the
normal
light, and
behavior.
everybody took off.
Wow.
Everybody took off down the road.
I don't blame him. I'd be out of there.
Yeah,
Your students probably think you planted them, is what I'm figuring.
yeah. Well, one time I used to joke with the one
God.
class. I took another class there, and it had 3 kids with red hair in it, and so I used to joke that the cult liked to sacrifice kids with red hair. So when we all, and then here the one kid who also was named Thomas, he had twisted his ankle earlier, so he wasn't sure if he was going to go the whole way. I told him, okay, well, tell me. Well, we get halfway up there, and they turn around and say, Professor White, what happened? What happened to the kid in the back? And he's gone. And so he didn't tell me he left. It turned out he did leave because his ankle was, but we didn't know. So we walked the rest of the way. They were panicked, like, what happened to him? He disappeared. And then we get back and we can't know what was his car. And then he didn't come to class the following week. Well, I didn't tell them. I knew at that point, but I let it go another week because
Right.
why not? But so weird things always happen there. And but the tombstones even changed meaning in the 90s though, because starting in the 90s, around 95, I started hearing a different version of the tombstone legend, that the tombstones didn't touch under a full moon. They were just inching closer and closer together. When they finally touched, the world would end.
That's what I've heard. Yeah,
I've heard that, and I think that's one of those ones where because I love it all, but do I believe in? I believe in the folk tradition, but that's one where I'm like, come on, like if you want to tell me they touch, I like that, but the end of the world, that this is some doomsday clock, that's a bridge too far.
Yeah, well, that was right around like 95 to around the year 2000.
I was about to ask, was that a Y2K thing?
Yeah,
it makes perfect sense.
Okay,
I remember being in not Baltimore. I was in Ocean City, Maryland, about 11 weeks before, and walking on the boardwalk, and they had the countdown happening.
Yeah.
So I imagine that was repeated in a lot of other places. But to hear of it being supposedly repeated in a cemetery with a couple gravestones is, again, a little like, why is that the message? Why is that the medium by which this message is being sent to us?
Right.
Yeah, and that's what happened over time. Is like the original legends were a little more believable. Then sometime around the 90s and early 2000s, a whole bunch of strange legends got attached. Some were like, there was a legend that there was a town of abandoned village that was lived in by former circus performers, like midgets, essentially.
Oh, really?
Midget village. Yeah.
Oh,
Now there really was, years ago, out in eastern PA, a town where a bunch of former circus performers lived, but it spawned other legends in other places. Other people said there was a half man, half deer walking around. I don't know what that was supposed to look like, but so there were all these other stories that kept circulating. The weird thing about it though was, like, when I was teaching a course, and one of these older students did a paper on it, and their brother-in-law was once a cop out there. He used to have to patrol that road. And, one of the stories that was often told about was the classic, and you guys will recognize this instantly, that when the road was open, the couple drives down the road and the car stalls, and the guy looks at it and says, I can't fix this. I got to go get help. And he walks away, never comes back. The lady hears scraping on the roof. Eventually she gets out. It's under the hanging tree. He's hanging from the tree. She runs off into the darkness and is never seen again. And we don't know who actually told the story then, but
thank you for saying that.
So she was repeating that in this paper, and she had her brother-in-law look at it, and he said, that's not how it happened. She was still in the car. And he said, we found him 2 days later in the woods.
Are you serious?
Yeah. And then, it was like a day or two later in the woods.
Oh my gosh.
Basically, it was never, because he was found hanging, so they couldn't prove it wasn't suicide, so it wasn't reported
as that
in the paper. But he said he definitely did not leave the car with a rope. So the guy always thought there was something weird about it.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
unless
nuts.
he had planned it out, and why would he do that? I mean, he would have to have a motivation to do that to her, to have stashed a rope somewhere. But
that's wild, because that's one of the things that, like, we've talked about a few times. Whenever you start looking into a lot of these stories, and just when you get into paranormal stuff in general, there's a lot of times where you don't find what you think you're looking for. You find something else that's you would have never even imagined. So that's just a wild example of that, I think.
Yeah, yeah, and the more I dig into these, and people always ask me, "Oh, well, what's the actual real legend?" And I tell them they're all the real legend because it's depending on who you ask, and that's sometimes the hard thing. Like when you write a book, you're picking a set. I try to get the most commonly told and some obscure legends and put them in writing, and even by writing the book, I'm changing the legend because then people read it and have my version.
Right.
So that's always the danger when you're writing about folklore. But I mean, at the same time, it's always evolving anyway. So people will often, in fact, at one time I wrote this in 2 different books. I discussed Shades of Death Road in Washington County. And I got kind of angry email from someone that was telling me I wasn't including the right legends and everything. And here they had only moved on the road a few years ago and had this whole different set of legends. And, really? And I had asked, and the other thing is up until recently, a lot of people just wouldn't talk about it. So you try to get information and they just will not give you information. You have to get like the young people usually will give you the information.
Right.
And so I wrote about it the first time with a little information, then I revisited in my Haunted Roads book with a lot more information, including things like mob hits found, like bodies left in cars and all kinds of stuff, but this person didn't acknowledge any of those legends and had a whole different set. And it's hard to explain to people sometimes that it's constantly changing, and the next generation is going to have their own spin on these legends.
Right. And
go on, Brendan.
I was just going to say, I think that's something I've recently been starting to think about with a lot of these stories, and like the set, like not thinking about them as like one story, but a set of stories. And I think in your I'm not sure if it's the most recent, but your Witch of the Monongahela book, I kind of wanted to see how you handled that, because in that book it's almost we're so far removed from those stories that you're now looking at other folklorists and historians and writers and trying to piece together what they may have had access to or come up with, or if it's like not even third person, it's like further down the line. So like how do you approach that stuff so that you can keep that context that you were saying of telling your version of the story without it being a new version?
Yeah. So Witch of the Monongahela, that was a difficult one because as you said, it's so long ago. I mean, she was 17, born in the 1760s, probably lived till 1844. But then legends continued throughout the 1800s.
Right.
And we take so much for granted now, and I see this even when I have to tell students. Like if you read a story or a firsthand account from, even say, like people will tell me, "Oh, I read this." A common one that's used as an example, it's not related. When people read about the Crusades and they say, well, they came in and slaughtered everyone in Jerusalem, the blood was up to their knees. The blood couldn't have been up to their knees. There weren't enough people in Jerusalem to fill the city up to their knees. It's physically impossible. That was hyperbole and exaggeration. That was common in the way people would write. So you have to understand how people would convey information in the past, which is one benefit I have being an archivist, is I see how information is created and how it changes and how it lives and what gets saved and what doesn't. And that's a huge thing.
And what is like the known context by the intended reader at the time.
Yes. Yeah. And so in fact, people have been writing books on like using the Middle Ages as an example of how people just abuse the history of the Middle Ages because they don't understand what was really going on. Dealing with the Witch of the Monongahela, what I did is I worked back. I mean, I had a little bit of historical information and a couple early newspaper articles. So I knew she was, at least the people writing the newspapers back then thought she was definitely real. She had a reputation for magic. So then what I did is I went back to the very latest, like the popularizer in the mid 20th century, George Swetnam, who, in the mid 20th century, people didn't realize how extensive the belief in folk magic was, right? So he found a couple different stories of witches and thought, oh, Mulderry, Muldell, these must all be the same person. They're all what's Fayette, Somerset, and Bedford. Oh, they must be the same person. How many witches can there be? Well, there were dozens and dozens of them. You know what I mean?
Right.
But we've actually talked to a powwow doctor before about like that was a fairly common belief, and And again, that's just one, that Germanic culture.
Yeah.
There's all these other cultures that we mentioned have their equivalency. So
Well, was it Robert Phoenix? I think
Yes.
you've.
Oh,
you've
I know Rob Phoenix. Yeah.
Oh, see, there we go. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, he gave me in fact, some of the photos I use of modern powwower stuff in the Witch and the Log.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Those are his. Oh, wow,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
so cool.
So yeah, so it's so basically what I did is I worked backwards then from what George Swetnam had access to, and I found all his sources. And luckily, some of his collections have survived. They have one at the History Center, one at IUP, I think, and if I'm remembering correctly. And so, even though there's not a ton there, he did point to what sources he used. And some were newspaper articles, some were other sources. But what I found going backwards is some of his sources were fictionalized accounts of real things. And so some of them were fictionalized accounts that were like 95% true. We just changed the name so we don't get sued.
Right.
Others were very, maybe 50% true or 20% true. And so what happened is I had to sift and see what was the most probable, but also sometimes you just don't know. It's the kind of thing that wasn't always recorded, like with Mull Wampler, and not to go into, be another 2 hours to explain the whole book, but there's three witches we think, I suspect merged their stories to become the modern legend of Mulderry. One of them, Mull Wampler, they're not even really sure she existed, but there's a whole bunch of Mary Wamplers in Bedford County that could fit her, and we know folk magic was being practiced there. And so it's just kind of a guess that this would have been a real person. Again, you never know for sure. And that's kind of sometimes the frustrating thing. But of course, when you study history, and like I said, being an archivist and stuff, people often put too much reliance on written documents.
Yes.
And sometimes not enough on oral history. The oldest oral tradition in the world dates from southern India, and it's older than all written records. And I don't know if you've ever heard of this. There's the animists that live in southern India have a song that's a series of sounds that repeats over and over again. And for a long time, it just sounded almost like animal noises, and people just dismissed it.
Right.
But here, some anthropologists studied it, and they realized that this was the record of the new animals they encountered when they migrated out of Africa.
Oh my God.
The first people, what they would have encountered at the time that what people they called Dravidians moved out of Africa to southern India, across Iran and down the coast of India. And it was literally new animals they encountered that they wouldn't have seen where they were at.
That's
this has been
wild.
passed down for 30,000-40,000 years.
That's insane. I've never heard that.
Yeah, it's crazy, and it survived. So sometimes oral information is accurate, and sometimes written information isn't. And this is the great conundrum. I mean, it keeps historians employed, but
right.
I'm glad you bring this up. One, not only because super interested in those pre-written cultures where they left very little evidence except for the stories that continue on and the songs that continue on after them. One of my things that I enjoy doing is recording old newspaper articles. And it is wild. You can see just you shouldn't put a lot of confidence in these. Not to drum up people's feelings about news media in present day, but when you read news articles from 1850s, 1870s, a lot of them are what we call, I'm trying to remember what we call today, where it's just an advertisement being hidden as a news story. Or some of them are very wild. I remember Brendan had to edit the recording of me. It was a story that came out of Danville, Pennsylvania, and it was a young boy had eaten a small snake, and it had ended up living in his intestine, and they had to remove it. Again, that sounds like a folktale. I don't believe that is an accurate depiction of what happened. One of my favorite books of yours is the Forgotten Tales of Pennsylvania, specifically because it's a very special book in the sense that it demands you go and pick up other books.
Yeah.
And it definitely came from somebody that's staring at old newspapers.
Yeah, that's what that whole series was a byproduct of other research. And it's this is a weird newspaper article. I'm going to put it in this book. And then, so basically it was every weird newspaper article went into that. And then I did one for Pittsburgh and Philadelphia too. And so it was this seems bizarre. Let's throw it in there. And it's just, if you want news of the weird of the past,
Yeah, it's a great book, and most of the entries are only a paragraph or two, but some of them are you can say, okay, this reads like a very historical, just the fact sort of thing, and then others are
Sound like
clearly
that.
folk tales, and then some were
But-
kind of in between, like the dog that got all the media coverage when it died.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and that just like speaking of these old books and going through some of these old things, one of my favorite elements in especially Pennsylvania related folklore is different like creatures that supposedly exist. Like we've done episodes on the Peninsula Python. We do lots of stuff on like Bigfoot and like all those kind of things. But my absolute favorite is hoop snakes.
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah, and I have a quick question too, because I've always thought hoop snakes were first written down in the 30 Years a Hunter.
So my question is, what are your thoughts on hoop snakes?
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting piece of folklore, the snake rolling up and or grabbing its own tail and rolling away. But I mean, I never really found the true, or I haven't found the true. I mean, if you want to go back to the true origin of a snake eating its own tail, you're looking at Norse mythology,
Right.
The Ouroboros.
or the Midgard serpent, or the Ouroboros, in older mythology. So there's an element there of representing, time until it's broken, and
Right.
a whole variety of things mythologically. The other thing that people often forget is like there used to be a thing where people just like play with a hoop with a stick and make it spin. It's like
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, kids like in colonial America. And so like, I often wonder if it wasn't like some like drunk dad, like, hey, watch out. The one time a snake formed the hoop and, like,
Right.
if it caught on, you never know.
It could be mundane like that.
Yeah, it could be mundane. It could be something, and it's one of those things where I've never been able to quite pin down, I think there are European versions.
Like versions.
Yeah. Like in Germany and stuff.
The
But
oldest one I ever came across was that Philip Tome, 30 Years a Hunter. And then it seems to have really stayed and became in that region of especially of northern Pennsylvania, because James York Glim, an English professor back in the 70s and the 80s up in Mansfield, collected several stories that were still being told, but they were clearly being told as jokes and not as a serious concern.
Yeah, and Pennsylvania has a whole category of folklore, like, with like the hoop snake, and another one's the squonk.
Yeah, squonk. Yep.
The weeping
things like that,
squonk.
where it's like some of it's just kind of, like the squonk is probably just like logger lore, some bunch of drunk loggers made up a
That's
story,
like a whole category right
Yeah.
there, basically. Yeah.
But then, on the flip side of
Yeah.
that, though, with the loggers and farmers, especially up in north central PA, you have legitimate werewolf folklore straight out of Europe. Like
Right.
legitimate, like you wouldn't be able to tell it wasn't European, not movie folklore, like the
Right.
real deal folklore. And you have a lot of that. And there's stories of spook wolves and ghost wolves and witches hexing sledges with logs on them. And there's a whole thing. And that's like area. There's all these old professions that have folklore that's lost, and even miners. Like used to be so much mine folklore. But even some of the mine folklore,
I think immediately of George Corson.
yeah.
And all the mining folklore and songs that he collected.
And, I had a student who was one of my better students I ever taught in the 20 some years I've been teaching. And she did a lot of research. She also was very interested in religion and the intersection folklore and religion. And her name is Catherine Barbera, and she's actually an archivist at CMU. But she had, kind of done a lot of research and tracked certain, especially like a lot of mining legends, but especially she was interested in like piece of mining lore that women were bad luck in the mines. But up until the beginnings of the Union era, women and children went in the mines because you got paid by the bucket, how much coal you could get. You brought your whole family, you had them fill it out. When the unions came in to try to specify and clarify the jobs and force the wages up, suddenly there was this kind of, women are bad luck in the mines. Everybody knows that. Children are bad. Children shouldn't be in the mines either, and there was this folklore to kind of reinforce what we would consider a normal work week and job. And, we should get paid a standard wage instead of by the bucket, and so sometimes the folklore works in different ways, or like the classic industrial folklore in Pittsburgh, Joe Mazurak, who was fake lore. It's kind of turned into real folklore in retrospect, but it started as a joke. Actually, a bunch of Croatians played a joke on a writer, and then it became folklore that was then a fake lore, I should say, it was adopted by the steel companies because it made them look good. But if you think, a guy that works his entire life in the steel mill and dies for the steel mill, that doesn't sound like worker folklore,
No.
Right.
And then, but eventually he represented, when the mill's closed, like the pride in what used to be,
Right.
He reminds me a lot of Rocky in the sense that we have the statue of Joe Majorak and we have a statue of Rocky Balboa.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that kind of like gets me like one of my other questions I wanted to ask you before we're done this evening. If you wrote a book on folklore around professions, I would be the first in line to buy it. Just to be clear, that sounds fascinating. But like, so like, what are some of the things that you either want to work on in the future or are working on, either just for your own purposes or for writing?
And so there's a couple areas I'm toying with. I have enough ghost stories collected for another ghost story book.
Oh, cool.
It's getting the willpower to sit down and do that. And I don't know when I'm going to get to that. Another one I want to tackle, especially after doing the Witch of the Monongahela, which is a lesser known piece, but 50 years ago, it was far wider in popularity. And I'd written a little bit about him in my first book, but I'd like to do a full-length book on Mike Fink and the legend of Mike Fink, and the keelboater, and he was like the arch enemy of Davy Crockett.
Oh yeah,
and
okay, yeah,
all that keelboating lore, and he was kind of like the original anti-hero tough guy, kind of a jerk, but he had to be tough on the frontier. And he's a very complex character, but he represented, and he's kind of from that era of tall tales. Where like
Brendan,
early America, you can outsmart the devil, you can do this, those tall tales where it was, American ingenuity.
Right.
Brendan, you might not remember this, but we had played a show in Harmony, and the Historic Society gave us a few books of folk songs that had been written by a Pittsburgh guy who, for some reason, I can't remember, he was connected with the Harmony Historic Society. He wrote Monongahela Sow, which was played by Pete Seeger and a lot of other people. But he had wrote about Fink. And I think in that songbook, we actually have a song written in the 40s about Fink by this fellow. I don't know if that's...
We're going to have to revisit that.
Yeah, I have that book somewhere.
Yeah, they actually used him as a villain on the old Davy Crockett TV show, the old black and white TV show. And the occasional recurring villain was Mike Fink. And so he kind of represented like the seedy underbelly of the frontier,
Yeah,
doing the keel boats and everything. But I've always had an interest in that, just something a little less spooky, a little more traditional folklore. But then I also have recently kind of gotten back in. For when I was young, I was really into the Civil War, and then I took a long break from the Civil War. So and the past couple of years, I've gotten back into it again. But I'd like to go back and do kind of a really good analysis of some Civil War ghost stories, Civil War era ghost stories, maybe.
I love our first episode. Was one of my friends telling a Gettysburg ghost story, and I've read a lot of I'm a big Gettysburg fan, so that sounds wild to me. Speaking of like ghost stories and everything, one of the questions I kind of wanted to ask you was what like a lot of the stories that you've talked about tonight, some of them are more prominent, like Loomis Road. Like a lot of folks have heard of that, but then stuff like Mike Fink, it might not be as popular. What do you think? Are there any stories that come to mind that are either vastly overrated or vastly underrated, as far as a rated, but like appreciated by the culture?
Yeah, I think as I've studied and I've gone through so many stories, it's hard to. One of the legends I love is the Pig Lady of Cannelton in Beaver County. It's like a 200-year-old headless ghost story. And
oh, wow. I'm not familiar. Okay.
Yeah, it's in my book, Supernatural Lore of Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And it's basically, short version, it's been seen for 200 years by all kinds of people. And, there's elements of it that are probably exaggerated and stuff. But, I mean, it's very well known in that area and probably deserves to be wider known. Basically, this woman... The McCaskies were in the American Revolution. Samuel McCaskey was down in Virginia, lost his land, but then he fought for the Americans, was given land in the depreciation lands. Beaver County. Went up there. His daughter stayed behind, got married, but then she came up to live with them. Something happened. Either the husband died or they got separated or something happened. Barbara Davidson, though, that was her last name now. The story is usually that, she's very beautiful. Everyone liked her. She was good shot, all kinds of stuff. One time the family had to leave North Beaver County to come to Pittsburgh to get some livestock and farm supplies. They left her in charge. When they came back, they couldn't find her. They searched for a day or two. They eventually find her headless body wedged under the house.
Oh my gosh.
And then, of course, there's a big search. There were rumors that the head was thrown in a mine up on the hill by an orchard. And for about 200 years, I'm not going to go into all the details because there's a whole bunch of stories, but her ghost or the killer's ghost was seen in about a 2 square mile area in various parts, like in these areas that used to be part of their farm for years. And then eventually, even Blackhawk School District, the middle school, every other year used to do a play about her and use it to teach history. And
that's cool.
There was the one, Rich Oswald, who's deceased now, was he was in charge of one of the schools and he used to be an English teacher. He collected all kinds of folklore on the legend. Like that was like his hobby, is documenting the Barbara Davidson legend. He had given me what he had to write my story. He's since passed away, but he ended up having an experience with Barbara Davidson himself directly. He was
probably very excited about that, considering it became a life's vocation.
Well, what happened is they made a haunted house on the site. It wasn't the original barn, but it was a barn. So the local Lions Club was trying to raise money. They're like, how about we do a haunted house attraction, on an actual haunted property? Right. And so they did the walk through haunted house, and then they'd take you down to the North Fork of the Little Beaver River, down by this campfire, and Rich would tell the story of the real story on a hayride. Then he'd ride back up and leave, And so you can imagine, it almost sounds like the start of a horror movie. All kinds of weird stuff starts happening to people. Like half the people involved had stuff happen, especially the girl that played Barbara Davidson. But one night by the fire, Rich had this full out of the smoke material, and people would used to see smoke form in the shape of the woman without a head. They called her the pig lady because in the 50s, some people started seeing her with a pig head. She used to be in charge of the pigs on the farm. Right. So the theory was, it probably was just an urban legend started in the 50s, but that she decided to replace her head with the head of a pig.
Oh, wow.
But she appears without the head to Rich and says, "Tell them Renault." And he's like, "What?" He's like, "And tell them Renault." And then he went and did research later after she disappeared, and that was all she said. And there was apparently found this reference to a half French, half Indian trapper whose last name was Renault, who was in that area around the time of her murder. And so he thinks that's who the killer was.
Awesome.
Yeah. So he passed away. But it was an amazing story. And I only heard about it. I'd been collecting this stuff for years since professionally. And I only heard about that one around 2013 or 2014.
Yeah.
Had this Renault character ever been in any of the legends before?
No, as far as he didn't do all fresh research on him. Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah.
So that's insane. That's
one of my favorite.
That's a great
story.
Yeah. And that's one of my favorite that's not as well known. Other ones that you kind of think of that are overdone. I don't know. There's so many that are. I guess I always think, if it's your first time hearing it, it's not overdone for anybody. There's some I've heard or told.
That's a really good point.
Times. I have poems memorized about ghosts, and like that somebody else wrote 30 years ago, because I've told stories so many times. So for me, it's hard to tell which ones are overdone because I just, hear them and tell them all the time.
Right.
But, it's one of those things where every time, if there's something new to come back to it, and that's the thing I found is even when I think I'm done with a story, inevitably all my books could use an update because I always learn more stuff after the fact.
Well, I have a question about stories. I'm curious. I know one of the things that frustrates me is there's the Harmony Inn, and the history of it has always said it was built by this Austin Pierce and that he was a railroad magnate. And I've done some just casual digging and found no, he didn't build the house because if he did, he would have been 8 years old when it was constructed. And even though he was involved in a railroad, he invested some, and it was an affair that didn't last for more than a few months. So I always get frustrated when I hear stories about it that attribute those things to him. I'm kind of curious if you've ever encountered some stories where there are some historical elements that are very quickly, easily demonstrated not to be accurate, that frustrates you. I'm kind of curious, and maybe not frustrate, but just that you like to point out.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stories that are like that, actually. And often it's not that, and sometimes, yeah, I mean, I can think of some, like there's some famous ghost stories where it turns out that a whole bunch of it was inaccurate. There's definitely stories like that. I mean, one of the famous stories that everyone says was completely inaccurate, but then a friend of mine found something that I think it influenced the story. But, so there's if you ever heard of the most haunted house in America, it's the Congliere Mansion. And most of that story is inaccurate, although it has pieces that are accurate.
This is about the scientist that was doing things in the house, as I recall.
Yeah, so quick recap, supposedly the Conglieres were carpetbaggers that came back after the Civil War. They brought a new maid with them that the husband had an affair with. The wife snapped, cut the maid's head off, was found on the porch with it in a rocking chair, killed the husband, etc. She's taken off. Then a railroad company buys it and houses it some workers. 2 of the workers die mysteriously in the basement. And it's empty for a while, and a doctor buys it, named Adolf Brunrichter, conveniently. And he starts doing experiments on, well, they don't find out till later. The house had no electricity, but electricity was arcing off the house and things like that. And eventually there's an explosion. Police come running in. They find bodies of women in the basement. He disappears. Some other gas company uses it, and the people think it's haunted. Then eventually in 1926, he resurfaces in a jail in New York and admits to all this crazy stuff. Writes in his own blood on the cell right before they let him go, what Satan hath wrought, let man beware. And then like a week or 2 later, the house explodes on the north side and leaves a crater. Well, the only true parts of that are the Congliere family was real. They were actually in the mob.
Mm-hmm.
They were mafia people in the 20s. Numbers, right? I shouldn't say mafia. They were
the Black Handers. I'm reading Russell Shorto's book on Small Town, which is, if either of you are not familiar with, phenomenal book so far, Russell Shorto. But yes, that name does appear in that book as he documents the early days of the mob in the region.
Yeah, but there was a real explosion. There was the huge gas tank explosion in the 20s on the north side. 3 huge natural gas storage tanks.
Yeah, it was huge.
One of the workers put an acetylene torch to it and it blew up. And it killed 26 people or 27 people. The only non-worker that was killed was Marie Congliere, who got hit in the neck with a piece of glass. Those parts are true. Now, the Dr. Brunrichter, everyone always just dismissed. But a few years ago, my friend John Shalkowski, who does the
Pittsburgh,
Pittsburgh,
fascinating.
Big fans.
He found about this house called the Bellevue Mystery House in the newspaper, where there was this house, and it's Bellevue, and that part of the north side where that house was. Today the house is gone. It didn't explode, though. It was just torn down. Now the interchange is there, but not far away, like a 5-minute drive up the road is Bellevue, and this house is also gone. I'm going to talk about, but there was this big mansion there that a doctor lived in, and he had like a nurse that lived in there too, and they ran it as a hospital. Well, here it was probably like, people saw this socialite from the East End go in there, and one day somebody noticed her, and there were some of these women that were missing locally. And here the police went and raided it, and they found like the socialite's cloak or coat and stuff. And here was probably a secret abortion clinic, and some stuff went wrong, and they buried a few women in other caskets, either with other people, or I can't remember if the police found a body in the basement. But it was there's elements of the Brunrichter story, them finding, it's not far up the road, and that Brunrichter element really emerges in the 50s or 60s, the earliest I can detect it. This would have happened in the 1912 or so, roughly around that time. So you can see how those stories might have merged in the intervening years.
Right.
And that might be where that piece of that story comes from. Again, we can't know, though. That's the problem with some of the stuff. You can't know for sure. But it's interesting that wasn't that far away.
I feel like that was for a long time one of the most oft-told stories of Pittsburgh.
Yes.
Specifically. In the region, maybe a little bit too. I think it's definitely been superseded by Blue Mist Road and a couple other legends. But I have to say, I was at a wedding we both were about a month and a half ago, and the witch trial in Allegheny County
Yeah.
in your story that you document that. Everybody I talk to seems to go to that story. And I'm kind of curious if you feel you become known for one story in particular, or if people ask you about the most, or if there's even just a type of story that now people come to you about or with.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most popular ones are the supernatural ones, of course, as far as folklore. And yeah, it really depends on what crowd I'm with. Blue Mist Road is a common one. I end up telling that one all the time. Green Man still comes up. Well, I think he's reached his zenith and is on the decline.
I think there's been so much good documentation of him.
That's an example of a legend that was probably pretty well documented publicly with not much craziness thrown in. And it has kind of taken hold. The B-25 in the river, there's less people than there used to be, but that used to be a big one. The plane that disappeared in the river. I think a lot of young people just don't even know that happened.
Right.
But it's still the ghost stories, like the Quaker Church in Periopolis. I still get that a lot. It's interesting because the past couple of years, I mean, the witchcraft stuff has been really popular, and it's kind of all over the board lately. I haven't seen one particular one that pops up more than others recently. It's kind of evened out a bit. It used to be, there'd be a handful of like the required stories I had to tell every time,
Right.
And now it's like people just want to hear different things. And I think that maybe that's because people now have access to so many versions of these stories. There's so much more literature on them now. There's more podcasts. There's more. And so people have heard a lot. So they're trying to hear ones they haven't maybe heard before. I know one that's been popular when I bring it up is like the werewolf folklore in Pennsylvania. So a lot of people don't know there was legit werewolf folklore here.
I wasn't going to say anything, but when you were talking about the Northern Tier earlier, and you mentioned like some real bona fide werewolf folklore, I wasn't going to say that I was not aware of that. So I'm going to have to go back and learn about this.
Yeah, and there's, in the fraction, only a fraction of the stories were saved too. So it makes you wonder how many weren't, But I mean, werewolves and witchcraft and folk magic all kind of overlap in real traditions, not, like the movie stuff. I mean, silver bullets were originally used to kill witches, not werewolves. But then witches could turn into wolves sometimes too. So it was all kind of
it'd probably be as effective at both, really.
Yeah,
when you're firing any projectile like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's no, yeah, it is funny how those things, like, sometimes when you take a step back, you're like, oh, this doesn't make any sense. This isn't even close to making sense, But that's part of the fun of it, and that's why I think that it's so wonderful that you're still having so many people coming up to you and wanting to share stories with you, and keeping a lot of these different traditions and stories kind of going. If people want to get a hold of you because either they have stories they want to share, or they just want to read your books, or just kind of follow what you're doing with folklore and everything, what's the best way for people to reach out to you or just follow along with what you're doing?
I don't have a big online presence. I mean, I have a Facebook page. It's me, and it has there's probably a million Thomas Whites, but it has the Witch of the Monongahela banner in the background from my book. So that's how you have the right one. Usually I post events. I don't post a lot of, some of these articles are like upcoming events. Like as we get near Halloween, I'll post a bunch of stuff that's coming up. I usually have 3 or 4 events a week then. And that's when I post any information about books. But if anybody wants to share stories, they can either contact me on there or just email me at Duquesne, whitet@duq.edu, and I collect all kinds of folklore. I have about 20 or 30 linear feet of files of stuff. And it's just, if people give it to me, it's the point now where like people tell me so many stories, I just can't even record them all. I don't have the time to actually, but certain ones, like I like to, zoom in on certain good examples or new things, or, and certainly, in any type of folklore too, I do mainly Pennsylvania, but I also have an interest in things like internet folklore and things like that, and these other areas. So
I think that is a place rife for continued. I was saying it 20 years ago. When we were in high school graduating, I said something to the effect of, in the future, archivists and anthropologists are going to be digging through the internet and those early pages and everything. And how could you talk so much about technology? And of course, the great technological leap of the last 20 some years, it's going to generate folk tales all of its own.
Yeah, and it's, you know, the internet. I mean, we've seen things like, I mean, people always say Slender Man, but there's a whole bunch of internet legends that have come up. One of my favorites, which just, as far as they can tell, only appeared initially online, was like the elevator game. If you ever heard that one, where you ride the elevator up and down in a certain order, and then you get off, like there'll be a floor that's red, and you basically, if you step through, you're in another dimension, and you have to ride them in the reverse order to get back, and it's this whole crazy thing. I mean, obviously, it's kind of like a Bloody Mary type game,
right?
You know? But
the man in the hat.
Yeah, exactly. There's all kinds of ones that have popped up, or ones that are, that's the thing that people tend to, we have people that tend to believe things they see online. The internet's no more accurate than any other form of communication.
Right.
So you have definitely this whole ripe area. Well, I even know, I knew the internet was really impacting folklore about 10 years ago. Maybe it was 10 years, maybe it was 8. I don't know. I lose track of time anymore. The neighborhood kids across the street were playing the Charlie game on their porch, which was popular, circulating online for a while. That basically primitive Ouija board type thing, I know that's where they got it, because they were on their phones, and they were, in fact, I think they were looking for instructions on their phone, and but that's the kind of thing that would have just been told word of mouth in the 80s,
right?
And now it just reaches all these people rapidly. So it's interesting, but you have to be quick with them, because they come rapid fire, you know what I mean? And sometimes they catch, sometimes they don't. And,
well, and that kind of gets back to, kind of where we started with you talking about almost like the half-life of these stories. Maybe that's something that's happening with the internet and how it's affecting folklore. Is it shortening that half-life? You're getting the generations are coming quicker and quicker.
Or will there be more copy paste stories, like the deceased children that push their car out of the harm's way?
Right. I think it's going to be a spoil of riches either way. It sounds like.
Yeah. And the thing is, I always tell people, they're like, oh, well, it's not happening this way, that way. Well, whatever way it's happening, that's the folklore, and that's the new way it's going to unfold, and so
folklore is like language, in that we have a lot less control over it than we think we do.
Exactly.